We're going to bring up our next speaker here, Andrew Millison. Grateful to have you here, Andrew. If you want to go ahead and unmute and come up to the front, we'll welcome you here.
All right. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Cool. And as Andrew's getting queued up here, do you have a presentation you want to share, Andrew?
Yes, I do.
All right, let's pull that up. And in the chat, I'd love to hear what your takeaways are, both from Bart and Sunny. A lot of you put your takeaways in there, and also from Jordan Steele from Ranching for Profit. Put in the key takeaways, the insights, especially those things that you're going to take action on. We're grateful that Zoom's back up and working, and prayers that have been said and intentions that have put out, specifically, again, Art's prayer at the beginning of this and the many prayers that I've offered. And yeah, it's great that we're back online here and we can finish strong. Andrew, tell us
All
where you're
right.
from. Tell us what you're going to be talking about here today, and we'll jump right
Okay.
in.
Can you see my presentation, by the way?
I can, yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
perfect. Great. Well, my name's Andrew Millison, and I am a permaculture instructor at Oregon State University. And I am a person who has been spending a lot of time looking at landscapes, designing landscapes, helping people learn how to design landscapes. And I also do a lot of traveling. So I've traveled around the world looking at some of the largest and most successful land regeneration projects on the planet. So I'm going to be zooming out a little bit and showing you some things today that we don't find in the United States, some things around the world here. And, when we're talking about prosperity, talking about the profitable regeneration, and I really feel like that's, prosperity is going to be rooted in the prosperity of the land. And in order to actually make a landscape truly prosperous, we need to follow the principles of nature, and that's going to take us to the watershed. So we're going to talk about the watershed. And we're going to talk about the watershed design as the foundation for an abundant and profitable landscape. So should I just dive right in, Jared?
Yeah, let's go for it, Andrew.
Okay.
I'm excited. Already my mind is working on this, and like, on what scale does it work?
Yeah.
We have a lot
Yeah.
of large scale people, we have small scale people. And so rather than ask questions, we'll save those for the end.
Okay. Great. So I'm gonna get a little bit philosophical on you here as we go. So yeah, anyway, I'm the founder of Oregon State University Permaculture Design here. And so some of you may be familiar with permaculture. Permaculture is a land design system, and it's really based on observing the patterns of nature. So I'm going to give you a little example here. I mean, right here, we're looking at a close up of the vascular system of a leaf. But for any of you out there who are familiar with observing landscapes, you can see that the same pattern that we find in the leaf's vascular system is a really similar pattern that we find when we look at the drainages and creeks and rivers of the landscape. It's the same pattern we find when we look at our own veins. And in permaculture, we really are looking at how can we be informed by the natural ways that things are flowing through the landscape to actually help us to design our own properties to be as abundant as possible. Now, the typical American rural landscape, right? We have squares and rectangles and these different shapes of property boundaries. They oftentimes, once you put in the grid of property ownership, that grid's going to end up being where we put fence lines, where we put roadways. But if you look below the red property boundaries, you can see this different pattern happening. We can see the pattern of water flow, right? And the pattern of water flow really has nothing to do with the grid of property ownership that we've put down on the land, yet it has a huge effect on soils, soil quality, vegetative growth, the water table. There's so much that's affected by how water moves through our landscape, right? Now, this is seen in the extreme when we look at cities, right? So for instance, San Francisco is known for the steep roads and, the cable cars and everything like that. But when we look at this grid of property ownership that's been, say, put over a city like this, and we can see that, the roadways that follow property boundaries oftentimes end up acting like the new conduits for water. So where before we had natural drainage patterns, once we put roadways in, oftentimes the roadways are moving water out of a system. And even in a city that gets ample rainfall, roadways can actually dehydrate that landscape and create a hydrologic desert, right? So we see it in rural areas as well. And so really what I'm here to talk about today is the watershed perspective of design, right? Here's the United States, and this is divided into the watershed basins, right? So I ask everybody there for a minute to take a second and identify which one of these watershed basins you are in, right? I'm up there in the Northwest in the Columbia River Basin. And, this really gives you a sense of just how huge the Mississippi Basin is, right? And then we've got the Colorado Basin there covering Arizona and Colorado and everything. And so if we were going to say, aside from how people have divided the landscape, if we were going to say, how did nature divide the landscape? We would look at the watersheds, the ridges, the hilltops, the mountaintops, and then the streams, or the way that water flow is divided on the landscape. Now, this isn't new. This was actually, this is a map here that was drafted by John Wesley Powell. So John Wesley Powell, as many of you know, Lake Powell is named after him. He was sent by Ulysses S. Grant to go survey the arid West and to make suggestions about how the arid West was going to be colonized by the settlers moving west. And so after John Wesley Powell spent like a few years. He rafted, was the first one to take a raft down the Grand Canyon. And he came back to Ulysses. Oh, and while he was gone, Ulysses S. Grant actually died. So by the time he came back, we didn't have airplanes and trains back then. By the time he got back east, he proposed that the arid West actually be divided by watershed basins, because he said that inevitably, if we didn't follow the water lines, that we were going to have conflict over water. So he not only proposed this map of how states should be divided by watersheds, he also proposed that every county within the state would also be divided by watersheds. And what that would create is that the political boundaries were also the hydrologic boundaries. And so he felt like there would be much more peace between people if the political boundaries, if communities controlled the totality of their water supply, which is the watershed, right? And so, of course, he got back, and then the railroad companies actually railroaded that idea. They wanted to put down the grid because they wanted to more easily commodify the landscape. So he was shot down, and we have what we find today. But this is a really great example here. Here's the Colorado watershed. I'm sure some of you here live in the Colorado watershed, and anybody that studies these types of things knows that there's been a tremendous amount of conflict over this water over the years, right? Because they actually measure the amount of water coming down the Colorado River during a very wet period, and it's not actually, there's not as much water in the system as was allocated. So, but here you can see the four corners there really arbitrarily dividing this watershed into this grid pattern, which has really created the foundation for a lot of the conflict that we've had and that we will continue to have as the basin dries out more. So it's not just the United States. It's just about every country in the world that is dividing their states. Here's a little quiz before I tell you, can you identify what country this is, right? This is the country of India. I've spent a lot of time studying the water work and the water systems and land management systems of India. So these are the watersheds of India. The states of India are actually divided by language. So I want to tell you about a project that is the largest land restoration project on the planet, that is working to restore at a watershed scale, to restore the hydrology of these systems. So the same problems that we have in the US are the same problems that we have in India with water table depletion, overdrawing water from the wells, erosion, water not soaking in, deforestation, all of these things, right? And so there's a very famous Bollywood star. His name's Amir Khan. He's like as famous as like Tom Cruise or something is in America. And he saw the problems of the rural India, where basically these villages were running out of water. They were running out of water. You know, they get the monsoon season, they have a long dry spell, and people were just having to flee their villages and go to work in the slums of the big cities, migrate to areas that there was work. And so he created a contest between the villages to build these water harvesting structures. And so the contest was how many water harvesting structures could each village build in a 45-day period. And so this is kind of what it looked like. All the villagers coming out, mostly working by hand because it's a fairly non-industrialized area. And in 4 years of running this contest, they actually were able to save the water of 8,000 villages, right? And so if you look at the number of people, each village is probably about a population of about 2,000 people. So we're talking about 16 million people whose fortunes were completely changed by this watershed scale land rehabilitation. And this picture right here gives you a little bit of an image of what we're talking about. We see all of these contour bunds and ponds and swales and placed in the landscape here. So when it rains, when they get those monsoon rains, the rains are stopped and soaked into the ground instead of running off. And when it's soaked into the ground, it builds the groundwater table, and then that water is then pumped out in the dry season for irrigation, right? But the thing that they have that we are lacking here is that the villages they're very ancient villages, and they were located in these areas where, by common sense, the village boundaries were actually the watershed boundaries. So when they decided to restore their village lands, they restored the political boundary and the community boundary and the watershed boundary were the same. So when they restored the village lands, they also restored the watershed. Because if you restore the entire watershed, then you can actually increase the whole groundwater table of that small basin. And so when I went there, and I've did about 6 videos on my YouTube channel from this organization. And it's really incredible traveling around with them because they literally transformed the well-being, the financial well-being, and the ecological and resource well-being of this very vast area, right? Because all it took in 45 days, and they built the water harvesting structures within the basin, and this is in the center of one of the villages here. This is me taking a picture of the map of the village lands, and they actually show the watershed treatments that they did within their boundaries. So they do this in 45 days, then the monsoons come, and the water soaks in all of these water harvesting structures, and they literally were regenerating their water table in one rainy season. And then they were able to, instead of just growing crops during the rainy season, they were able to grow crops during the dry season. And suddenly people went from being like in a desperate state of poverty to being like rich as farmers. And in a way, I think giving the economy, you can actually get richer as a farmer in India than you can in the United States, unless you have a very exceptionally large tract of land. So things are different here, right? We do have this grid of property ownership. It's very difficult to actually control the amount of land that you can to really restore an entire watershed. But there are applications that people are using more in Western society to put patterning over the landscape, farm patterning that is actually retaining soil, retaining water. Okay, and one of those is called keyline design. Some of you may have heard of that, right? And this is one example in Switzerland here. This is a really nice example here in Vermont. And, you can see here, I mean, this is a grazing property, and he's put rows of trees. These are agroforestry rows. So they're productive trees, there's fruits, there's wood. But he's put them on a pattern within the landscape that they are retaining water, right? So the cattle and his cattle move in between these trees, but the trees themselves and the water harvesting infrastructure that the trees are planted on are creating a water retention landscape. And of course, you can see that there's ponds integrated into this landscape as well. Now, this is not enough time, of course, in this talk to explain the whole keyline design system, but there's a lot of examples throughout the United States. Here's another really nice example. This is the New Forest Farm. This is in Viola, Wisconsin. This is a fellow named Mark Shepard. And, it really goes to show that when we're talking about designing a permaculture system where the land, you're talking about profitable regeneration. So we're talking about designing a system where the land actually increases in its natural value over time. So that's soil retention, soil building, right? Getting perennial plant infrastructure integrated into your system, building soils, and having water management that actually gives you increasing water supply. So this patterning here, where it's an integration of trees and crops planted with the existing contours, or in response to the contours, this is a lot of what we're seeing, the types of systems in the US that are fulfilling these goals. However, I've just zoomed out on that same property I showed you. This property is still confined within the grid. So you can see the swirly kind of patterns of that property, but then you can see the adjacent properties are still have more conventional treatment. So it's very, like I said before, it's very difficult to have a complete watershed basin in order to work with, right? So we're still I would say that superimposing the grid of property ownership, superimposing a grid over the non-gridded landscape is really one of the fundamental flaws of our society, really, because it makes it very difficult to have a complete intact unit to work with where you can get the full benefits of land regeneration within a watershed, right? So some of you who maybe have large tracts of land, you might actually find that you have contained watershed basins within that. So you're at a real advantage. But for most people, they're living in a fragmented watershed. Now, another adaptation when you have a fragmented watershed is designing modularly. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the resilience of modular design. I've also, in the last year and a half or so, I've had the opportunity to travel to sub-Saharan Africa with the United Nations World Food Program and see some spectacularly large land restoration projects. So they're using these half-moon structures, right? These half-moon structures to harvest water. They're putting in these rows of half moons. And so these half moons are oriented in a way where when they get big rainfall events, the water's flowing in and it is collecting in these half moons. Now, there are a lot of different styles of these half moons based on their needs. Some of these half moons, they're taking highly degraded landscapes. So some of these half moons, they're taking these degraded landscapes and they're planting annual crops like sorghum or millet. Some of them they're putting in pasture crops like we're talking about, like the grasses that we saw, and then some they're actually planting trees for other benefits. So here's a little diagram here of a system where they're planting both trees and grasses, right? So the water from these monsoon rains, they get about 3 months of rain, 3-month rainy season, and they have about 9 dry months. So they're collecting water in these half moons. During the rainy season, they're sowing grasses. They're growing grasses for animals to come in. They have cattle, they have goats, they have camels. But then they're also planting these very hardy thorny, woody desert trees. So these trees are growing, and the half moons are spaced far enough apart that you can have both trees and grasses growing. And then in the dry season, the trees actually provide forage for camels and for goats. That'll eat. I mean, it's unbelievable what a camel will eat. I mean, they'll literally munch on the thorniest of gnarly, acacia trees that you could find. So it gives them this resilience throughout the long dry season. And so this is what it looks like when they fill up with water. I was there during the rainy season here, and so the orientation of these half moons is based on slope. But again, I want to return to the idea that this is a modular design. So you don't have to necessarily have a whole watershed basin. Each little area can be, you can put these small, they're putting these small water harvesting structures based on the slope of that area, right? And then, I mean, this is what it starts to look like. You have landscape scale water infiltration. Now, Bill Mollison, who's the founder of the permaculture system, he has a video that he made back in the desert around outside Tucson, Arizona, where they had an imprinter. So it was uh, a kind of thing that you hook to the back of the tractor, and as it turned, it would do land imprinting, and they would run back and forth and imprint and dent in the land simply as a place to collect seed that's blowing in and collect water, concentrate water. So this is essentially the same principle, but non-mechanized, because these are countries that don't have, that are not really industrialized enough to be able to do this with machines. But it's the same pattern essentially, but at a large scale. As you can see how water is really sitting in these structures after heavy rain here. And this is the result, right? We see this forest area right here is actually someone's drawing on my screen there. This forest area right here is actually the result of having these half moons. So to go from these really extremely compacted dry landscapes that are only very marginally productive during the rainy season to a forest like this is a massive change. And it has huge results on, I mean, of course, the things I've talked about on the water table, for instance. Now we don't have water running off. We have water soaking in the ground, building up that water table. There's so many yields. I talked about grasses. I talked about forage from trees, but there's also wood. So people here will cut wood for cooking. There's also medicines. And, in your context in the US, you could think of all the different yields that you could get from different woody perennial plants, right? But the establishment of perennial vegetation really has very long-term ecological effects. And when we're talking about profitable regeneration, we're talking about having long-term beneficial ecological effects that just make the microclimate better over time, make the soil better over time. So a couple of those long-term effects, check my time. A couple of those long-term effects are wind protection, right? Which is huge. And especially when you start to multiply these areas, you really can have a great wind buffer, and wind, as we know, can be a very erosive force and a cooling force as well. So, and of course, then there's the water, the hydrologic effects over time. And then there's some interesting integrations with these systems with some of the other stuff. Like, I don't know if people have heard of syntropic agriculture coming out of Brazil here, but it's the combination of annual production along with biomass production of woody plants interspersed with each other. So, in these systems, they're growing the trees, they're also doing annual cropping, and they're having windbreak, they're having water harvesting, and then the woody plants that are surrounding the annual cropping areas are actually producing biomass that are then used in composting to improve the annual cropping areas. So it's a symbiosis between annual and perennial cropping where the perennials are really helping to build the soil for the annuals. And that's, again, there's another topic we could talk about a whole lot. Here is a another close-up of this image. And you just look there on the right-hand side, you can see what barren ground. We're talking about barren, compacted land that's being transitioned to lush agriculture. And a lot of this, we have a lot of very highly degraded land in this continent as well, in the United States, that could, really benefit from similar methods. Yeah. So, in these cases in Africa, the recovery of degraded landscapes really equals the alleviation of hunger and poverty. And, you could translate that in the United States to the recovery of degraded landscapes could really equal prosperity. And that's what you're here at this conference about. So I'm almost at the end of my time here. I'm going to give you my takeaway messages. So first off, the fundamental flaw of civilization is superimposing a grid of land management over the watershed pattern, which is the pattern of how water flows across the landscape. There are huge advantages to working within an intact watershed basin. So in India, for instance, these villages, they're working with already intact hydrologic units. There are strategies to work within fragmented watersheds, key line design. I showed you a few examples of that. And massive scale projects use smaller modular units to avoid large scale failures, and they have flexibility within the watershed. So like those half moons. So that was my, let's see, I've got a few minutes left for questions here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is awesome. Go ahead and share the way to be able to continue the conversation with you, or what people would want to know, or where people can go to take the next step if they're like, hey, this resonated with me.
Yeah. Well, we have a permaculture design certificate course. We do an online course. It's open for everyone. That's through Oregon State University. And also, I have a YouTube channel. I have so many videos about this stuff. I've got videos from all over the world. We have, it's doing very well. Lots of people watch it and enjoy it. So it's just Andrew Millison is my name. Yeah.
Love it. Love it. What is the economic viability of doing this at scale? Meaning, okay, so we've got a 700-acre upland pasture just out to the west of our home with a pretty good slope on it. And, we've messed around and dug a few swales and pocket ponds and things. Can you speak to that a little bit? Like, how do we're all about being profitable and making sure that whatever infrastructure we put in is going to cash flow.
Yeah, well, it depends. Yeah, it depends where you're starting, because if you are starting in a situation where you actually have loss of soil through erosion, and you have loss of water from your system, and these are valuable to you, then, the cost of bringing a landscape from a state of degeneration to a state of regeneration, that could be extremely valuable. So, a lot of these systems are, they sort of shine the most in a way in like in landscapes that really need some help.
Yeah.
There's definitely, I can't say that putting in water harvesting structures is really right for every landscape at all, but I would say that including perennial infrastructure, so getting trees integrated, even whether it's just on the edges of that field, or actually including perennials in there, economically, that can create another long-term yield, like a long-term high-value wood product, for example. But it's also going to provide habitat, which, depending on what you're growing, you could be, helping with pest control. I mean, each situation's unique. Yeah.
Yep. Good. Context matters. And I think the principles, understanding them are super important. We just earlier talked about the 4 ecosystem processes and the broken water cycle in many of our watersheds. And this absolutely addresses that, recharging these aquifers. That's a must if we're going to truly steward the land. and if we have the long view in it. So Andrew, well, thank you so much for being
Thank
part of
you.
this lineup. I encourage you to go and check out what he's doing. William DeMille, who spoke earlier, he actually uses some of your YouTube education with his students that come on the ranch during the summertime. And
Yeah.
so at some point, we'd love to get you out here. We'll follow up with you afterwards and see if that's something you could do in your off season, which I don't know if you have an
Yeah.
off season, but
I don't have much of an off season.
okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Great.
All right. We'd love it. But,
Great. All right. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
okay. Thank you. Thank
All
you,
right.
Andrew.
Okay.
Hey,
Take
let's
care.
give Andrew a big, some gratitude. That's the best way. You know, we can't give him a round of applause here because you guys are muted, but tell him give him some thanks, give him some takeaways. And the best form of gratitude, I think, is emulation and being able to say, hey, this is what I'm going to do because of what I've learned here today. So if you can share
Awesome.
those ideas in the chat, that would be awesome.